Okay, now we can get to the questions. So the first topic that we will be addressing is free speech in safe spaces. So the first question is, how do you feel that universities across the country, particularly Virginia Tech, have handled the concept of safe spaces, specifically interacting with students' First Amendment rights to express themselves without fear of reprisals from their community? Republicans?
Well, the idea of safe spaces in general goes against the idea of freedom of speech. Just growing up, I remember in 8th grade, one day the KKK decided to march down through my hometown. Everything they do is hateful. No one's going to defend them. However, I had a English teacher at the time who was a lifelong Democrat, and in front of the entire class, because we were all upset about it, like a bunch of 8th graders will, she said she just started insulting President Bush. And she said the same freedom that lets them march down the middle of the street and say their hateful things lets me insult the president and not go to jail. And I think that was an eye-opening moment for me. When you limit freedom in any context, you limit it for everyone, and that's not something that we need to be doing.
Democrats, you're next.
Are we next? Okay. I just want to challenge the idea of safe space and free speech. Free speech is a constitutional right. However, it cannot be read in an absolutist manner. The courts have never read free speech in an absolutist manner as such. For safe spaces train people to be sensitive to issues and use terminology that's rooted in the experience of those communities. It's not saying you can use XYZ words, it's asking you to understand the origins and the oppressions part of it. Speech is controlled by time, means, and manner according to the Supreme Court of the United States, and speech is content neutral, thus meaning that we have the ability to regulate that as well. When free speech is only read in an absolutist manner, it's never been like that legally. Courts have always seen it as changing and being able to be modified. Court explicit knowledge that speech is subject to time, place, and manner.
Greens, you're next.
I think we have to differentiate on the categories of free speech. So if it's free speech to criticize the government, that's a whole nother level entirely from the free speech that we might use to demonize minorities in this country, whether it be Muslims or black people or people who feel their rights aren't protected. And with those regards, the Green Party simply leaves up to the administration, and we would hope that those groups would go to the administration where they feel that they need protection, and the administration would approve it under a certain procedure. So I think these are key differences that we need to keep in mind on this issue.
Would any more groups like to respond?
Thank you. Academia has been a place where students can discuss intellectual ideas thoughtfully and analytically. However, students have also been able to utilize spaces to promote their own ideas and to promote safety and comfort for students in troubled times in safe spaces. However, today, some students wish to engulf the entire campus into a permanent safe space, which is toxic to a long tradition of intellectual reasoned discourse at universities. And we as libertarians hold free speech as a critical virtue of a free society.
May I add?
Yes, you can continue.
I heard from previous groups that they are okay with limiting free speech and that free speech should not be absolute. I just want to remind people that the greatest advances in this country are a result of absolute free speech, which was very offensive during the time, starting with women's rights, with civil rights. If there was no free speech, the government could have prosecuted Martin Luther King much more easily if the First Amendment wasn't there. So yes, free speech is an absolute right because it can be used to the same speech that you use to criticize government. Yes, there could be some jerks out there that criticize and try to offend minorities and other people, but there's something that we cannot be selective because who is the one who selects? Are we willing to let the government select what is offensive and what not?
Would anybody like to respond? Democrats?
When I talk about free speech being absolutist, I'm not talking about just the constitutional implications. I'm talking about how it's read legally, like in the Supreme Court. And according to the Supreme Court, speech is subject to certain restrictions based on time, place, and manner. And because of these restrictions, speech is not just absolutist. You can't just go and say whatever you like. I mean, there are tons of court cases that address the issue of free speech and using it in certain ways that are subject to time, place, and manner. And so when it comes to free speech and the issue of safe spaces, they almost don't have any relevance with each other because safe spaces are not exclusive spaces where no one can have unchallenged thought. Safe spaces are just created so students can build networks, nothing to do with free speech whatsoever. The only thing that's asked is that you respect the people that are in that space.
Greens?
Thank you. I would like to say that there are a lot of students at this school that are veterans or have survived a traumatic experience, and they have psychological issues that they can't control and should be respected. And in that regard, I think that there should be some protection in that case because nobody can really control that. They can't control whether or not they're, experiencing some major issue, and they should have safety on campus. They should be able to know if something is coming up that is extremely violent or visually appalling in advance. And also, yeah, minorities do need protection. Minorities should have free speech, and nobody's necessarily challenging that at all.
Republicans?
Just to address the first point, when the libertarians already hit on this, when the government decides what speech is hateful and what speech isn't, the government will invariably decide that any speech against it is hurtful and hateful. So giving the government that power or any organization that power will then lead in the limitation of free speech against it. And also, there's a difference between safe spaces and allowing individual professors, to make the autonomous choice to give trigger warnings saying, hey, I'm about to show a graphic clip from a battlefield or anything like that.
Would any more groups like to respond? Democrats?
I just wanted to add to what Valencia had already explained, that safe spaces are not about government mandate for what you can and can't say. They're about opening dialogue and understanding the origins of the things that some people try to say. Safe spaces are about community and people choosing to open dialogue in a way that's inclusive to everyone, including minorities who are historically marginalized.
Libertarians?
As far as speech and being absolute, as far as legally, absolutely, it's not an absolute right, and the First Amendment has never been interpreted that way. But when we're talking about safe spaces on campus, safe spaces are absolutely fine, and that's definitely within the First Amendment rights of those students. But when you were talking about turning an entire campus into a safe space, if we're going to talk legally speaking, that's definitely unconstitutionally overbroad. So it's all about degrees when we're talking about safe spaces. So just want to bring that point.
Greens and then Democrats.
I think we need to review what we mean by free speech. As I was saying earlier, we can use free speech for many different values and to accomplish many different things. And if that goal is just, then we're for it. If it's unjust, then let the arguments be heard. Again, we support free speech. But in the cases of demonizing minorities, we need to think critically. And that's why we propose the administration solution. Another example of this would be the Charlie Hebdo caricatures that were shown that were demonizing essentially many Muslims throughout the world. And we should stand with minorities in their struggles for their rights. Thank you.
Democrats?
Free speech has always been subject to regulation in cases like Cohen v. California, Tinker v. Des Moines. It's the reason I can't shout fire in the middle of this building right now and get arrested. And I also want to present with trigger warnings is that trigger warnings are established as a way to acknowledge the fact that people have PTSD and experiences like such. For me, that means my professor letting the class know when we had a graphic reading of lynchings and rape, her telling the class, I'm handing you a reading. It's on lynchings and rape, so be prepared. Trigger warnings are necessary when it comes to spaces because we need to acknowledge the fact that people have different lenses and they're shaped different ways. And also sociologically, safe spaces have been proven effective for debate, actually even better. Because safe spaces ask you to come into the room with an element of respect, there's no trolling, no personal attacks, and in sociological studies done by Safe Spaces Experiences of Feminist Only Women by Lewis can I finish? Or
Yeah.
yeah, women and people that experienced the testify in those spaces said they felt more comfortable disagreeing because of the fact they wouldn't be personally attacked.
Libertarians, Republicans, and then we will move on to the next question.
Okay, regarding the safe spaces, sorry, thank you. Regarding the safe spaces, as Joe mentioned earlier, we are fine with safe spaces. If you want to reserve a room and have a discussion completely protected from ideas that you don't like, we are fine with that. That's within the property rights of everyone to do. Now, with the free speech, the previous speaker mentioned yelling fire in a crowded theater. Yeah, you cannot yell fire in a crowded theater, and there was a Supreme Court case that established that. But do you guys know how the Supreme Court came about? It was because the government was trying to go against people who were protesting involvement in World War I. So anti-war activists were being pushed against and saying that their speech is dangerous. And they came up with this hypothetical example out of nowhere with yelling fire in a crowded theater. Nobody had yelled fire in a crowded theater. They were opposing the war. Thank you.
Republicans?
The issue with yelling fire in a crowded theater is it could result in someone's death. Because if I yell fire right now, everyone flocks to the exit. Someone could be trampled in the stampede. If I yell, "Hey, I'm going to kill you," right in front of a cop, I am going to get arrested. However, that limitation does not include any names or anything that somebody might find hurtful. Walking up and calling someone a big doo-doo head is not grounds for arrest. It's grounds for being called a jerk, but it's not grounds for arrest. So limiting language and limiting the language we can use, can people use those words? Yes. Should they use those words? No.
So the safe spaces that the Democrats were describing there were actually the spaces that we see on this campus every single day. An open environment for open discussion that's inclusive to all groups of people. That's why we're able to have any type of table out on the drill field when we're walking by trying to get our attention and talk to us. The safe spaces that they actually want to implement are a way for groups to isolate themselves from ideas that they don't like or that they find offensive. That is not only counterproductive to themselves and their own growth, but it's counterproductive to society's growth.
Thank you. So the next question is, how has the concept of political correctness affected the rhetoric used for public statements during this election by all candidates and politicians? Libertarians?
Yes. To quote the words of Tyrion Lannister, "When you rip out a man's tongue, you are not proving him a liar. You're only telling the world you fear what he might say." This actually describes political correctness to a certain fair degree. By silencing speech that people try to find as indecent or politically incorrect, you're shutting down debate on that speech rather than exposing this type of hateful speech for what it truly is. Let the bigots expose themselves and prove them wrong in a civil discourse instead of shutting them down from the beginning.
Who would like to respond? Democrats?
At what point does your language and your rhetoric and the vitriol that you spew become violent, is my question. At what point do the things that you say actually get people killed, actually end up hurting people, inspiring violence in others? That is what I would basically ask when you talk about a war on PC culture, whatever that might be. You're basically talking about, you're throwing being a decent human being out the window. I don't know when or why that happened, but I don't know what a PC culture is or why you would have a war on a PC culture. Thank you.
Republicans?
Okay, so you're talking about politically incorrect speech that incites violence. So would you classify speech coming from Black Lives Matter protesters saying, we want dead cops, we want them now, as this politically incorrect speech? Because last time I checked, that party there supports that movement. So,
Greens?
The so-called PC culture is actually a structure that we've come up with over many years to avoid bullying. And I think everybody in this room can agree that bullying sucks. Being on both sides of it eventually sucks, because if you emotionally abuse somebody to a point, you can have some serious repercussions. And the PC structure that we have is designed to prevent people from going down that path, a little at a time as it may be, but also realize that we do have riots in this country that are inspired by racial division. So at this point in our timeline, it would really be a bad time to be stepping away from being politically correct, in my opinion.
Democrats?
All right. PC culture often means refraining from engaging in speech that's deliberately harmful to people, specifically derogatory speech, which is targeting someone for innate human characteristics that harm their human dignity. When we use extreme examples like Black Lives Matter saying all cops must die, which I don't think they've ever said, but the fact is that it's a power move. Black Lives Matter is a lower class movement. They're being oppressed. And so there's a difference in power dynamics between punching up and punching downwards. And although it's an awful thing to say, I agree, and it should not be said, there's a quite different implication from a white power movement saying all blacks must die, and historically that's happened, versus a Black Lives Matter group or Black Panthers or anyone punching up. Both are wrong, but one has more powerful implications. And I also want to ask is that conservatives like Yana Milopoulos or something along those lines have constantly attacked Anita Sarskatine for her feminist review series. She's gotten death threats, rape threats. She can't even speak in public without that. So is that part of PC culture as well, when you get rape threats from conservatives?
Libertarians and then Republicans.
Okay, there was a question raised, where does speech become violent? Like, I'm paraphrasing. The Supreme Court has answered that question. Speech will become violent when it becomes a threat. And what does constitute a threat? First, you have to say, you have to have the intention to carry out the threat, and you have to have the means to carry out the threat. So if one of those three conditions is not satisfied, it does not constitute a threat. So the Black Lives, certain people in the Black Lives Matter shouting things against cops, or people shouting racist things, that is still protected speech. It's abhorrent, we don't like it, but it is constitutionally protected speech. Now, however, we hate them a lot, but that speech sparks a discussion. Yeah, it's not the right way to do it, but it sparks a discussion. And it's definitely not a threat, unless all three of those conditions are met. Thank
Republicans?
You.
First, to address the point about Milo Yiannopoulos, he did not say those. Some followers did. What he said was freedom of speech. What they said is not covered by freedom of speech and isn't. Second off, to address the point, Black Lives Matter has been shutting down freeways, chanting, you can find videos of this on YouTube and other social media sites, pigs in a blanket, fry like bacon, and other things like that during their protests. But yet no one argues whether or not statements like that. The idea of punching up and punching down is just to put some people on their toes and make them feel like they don't have rights while giving rights to other people. Freedom of speech works both ways. If I'm allowed to insult you, you're allowed to insult me.
Greens?
I find it interesting that the issue that keeps being brought up is the Black Lives Matter chanting, because it proves the point that PC should be in place. People should respect the political correctness culture, because clearly what they're saying is not PC, and if that enrages the conservative end of the spectrum, then that proves the point. But also, yeah, no, they should not be saying that. But also, Black Lives Matter is a chapter-led organization that has really barely any national coordination, and so it's very easy to find poor examples of leadership on a local level, and that doesn't necessarily speak for the entire organization as a whole.
Republicans?
So I think that the war on PC is not necessarily towards statements that are made, such as what Black Lives Matter or any other group that incites violence that could cause harm towards another person. The war on PC deals with statements that are made in which a person construes or interprets that statement to be offensive and hurtful to a view that they have. That's the war on political correctness. It's not on whether a statement is interpreted as a threat. It's whether or not that the statement doesn't necessarily agree with the receiver's alignment or with their beliefs.
Democrats, and then we will be moving on to the next topic.
Okay, so as far as Anita Sarskatine goes, I could pull from a billion examples of women being attacked all over Twitter. Leslie Johnson quit quit Twitter over her mistake, over all the conservatives or conservative followers that, if we're going to generalize, are part of the Conservative Party as well, if we're going to generalize Black Matters with that as well. And so because of that, is that considered politically correct then? And also, political correctness is about affirming people's human dignity and what they prefer, and also realizing that we're using terminology that comes from those communities that says what they want to be called instead of using terms that are oppressors. So using transgender slurs, for example, is to say, not using them as an example of political correctness. We say transgender because that comes from their community. It's asking for decent respect. So why is it so hard to give humans respect and equality?
Thank you.